This morning, just after sunrise, the man suspected of brutally killing 36 women met the long, drawn-out demands of justice. Bundy was executed before an atmosphere that was almost circus.
What goes through the mind of a man like Ted Bundy in his final hours? Did he feel remorse for the brutal murders he committed, or was his fear of death the only thing that consumed him? On January 23, 1989, Ted Bundy, a man responsible for the deaths of at least 36 women, had only hours left before his execution. For years, he had evaded justice, manipulating the system and those around him. But now he was trapped in a prison of his own making. Just hours before his execution, a final visitor walked through the prison doors, someone whose presence would shake Bundy in a way no courtroom ever had. This is the final countdown of Ted Bundy, a man who spent years controlling his own fate, only to realize that in the end, there was no escape. Before the final moments in his prison cell, it's important to understand the man who became one of America's most notorious serial killers. Ted Bundy wasn't born evil, but his life slowly veered toward darkness. He was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, to an unmarried young woman, Louise Bundy. Ted's early life was full of confusion, as he was raised by his grandparents, believing his mother was his older sister. His true father's identity remained a mystery for much of his childhood. Despite these early struggles, Bundy was considered a bright and charismatic child. He had a natural charm that helped him make friends, and he did well in school. As he grew older, his good looks and smooth personality helped him fit in. People often described him as intelligent, ambitious, and personable. He went on to study at the University of Washington, where he even pursued a degree in law, though he would later use that knowledge for darker purposes. But beneath the surface, Bundy was a man with a dark side. He struggled with relationships, especially with women, and there were signs of violent behavior. As a young man, Bundy's relationships often turned possessive, manipulative, and abusive. In the early 1970s, Bundy began to commit a series of horrifying crimes. He lured women to secluded areas, using his charm to gain their trust before overpowering and assaulting them. His victims were usually young women with long dark hair parted in the middle, a specific type he appeared to be obsessed with. Bundy's killing spree started in Washington state in 1974, though he would later expand his crimes to other states, including Utah, Colorado, and Florida. The police were unable to connect the dots between the disappearances, and Bundy kept evading capture for years. His charm, intelligence, and ability to stay one step ahead of the law made him a particularly dangerous and elusive predator. He even represented himself during parts of his trial, further displaying his manipulative nature. By the time Bundy was arrested in 1975, his true nature was beginning to emerge. He was a man who could charm anyone, yet he harbored a terrifying secret, a violent killer who preyed on vulnerable women. Bundy's arrest did not bring immediate justice. His trial and the shocking details of his crimes captivated the nation. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Bundy continued to deny his guilt, maintaining his innocence until the very end. Bundy didn't stop his crimes while in jail. He broke out of prison twice, and after each escape, he went on killing until the police caught him again. His tricky behavior, even in jail, made him great at fooling people until his last day. The guy who once seemed like a likable and smart law student able to make anyone believe he was innocent, now faced the fact that he would die. His final day on January 23, 1989, was the unavoidable end to the fear he had caused for years, a man who had tricked, controlled, and killed with scary accuracy. Now on death row, his fate was sealed. The final 24 hours of Ted Bundy. It was 6 o'clock on a cold January morning, and the clock was ticking. For Ted Bundy, one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, this was the beginning of his last day on Earth. After years of evading justice, manipulating the system and leaving behind a trail of death and devastation. Bundy woke up in his cold, windowless death row cell at Florida State Prison. There was no more running, no more appeals. Today, he would face the consequences of the monstrous acts he had committed. Today, he would meet his end. Bundy's day began like any other day, but with one glaring difference. This was his last day alive. He woke up in his cold, windowless death row cell at Florida State Prison. The cell, which had been his home for years, now felt like a tomb. Bundy knew that there would be no more manipulation, no more chances to escape. The time for him to face what he had done had finally arrived. The prison guards arrived with his usual routine, a cup of coffee, lukewarm and bitter, just like the reality he was facing. The simple act of being handed coffee felt almost mocking, like a cruel joke. The man who had once been full of life, ambition, and charm now found himself sitting in a tiny, lonely cell, awaiting his death. The irony of it was not lost on Bundy. For years, he had been able to charm his way out of trouble. But today, all of that was meaningless. There were no more lawyers to manipulate, no more appeals to file. In that quiet moment, with the bitter taste of coffee in his mouth, Bundy had no choice but to accept what was about to happen. His once clever mind must have raced, trying to process the fact that today was the day he would die. The fact that it was all coming to an end in just a few short hours must have filled him with a mix of dread and disbelief. Was he in denial? Was he afraid? Or had he come to accept his fate, knowing that no one could save him now? As the clock ticked forward, Bundy settled into the grim routine of the morning. The guard made another round, checking on him in his cell. For years, Bundy had been known for his charm and his ability to manipulate those around him. But today, none of that mattered. There was no one to charm, no one to deceive. It was just Bundy sitting in a small cell with only his thoughts and the ticking of the clock to accompany him. As the day moved forward, Bundy's legal team, led by his attorneys, Polly Nelson and Jim Coleman, continued their frantic efforts to stop the execution. They filed last-minute appeals, hoping to buy Bundy more time. They argued that Bundy was not mentally competent enough to be executed. They pointed to his past, suggesting that he was suffering from psychological issues that made him unfit for execution. But all of their efforts were in vain. The courts, one by one, rejected the appeals. The United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, turned down his final request for a delay. Bundy's hopes for a last-minute relief vanished, and his fate was sealed. His legal team had fought hard, but nothing could stop what was coming. Bundy now found himself powerless. He had spent so much of his life manipulating the legal system, representing himself, and fighting for his freedom. But now he was facing a system that he could no longer control. The man who had once been so confident, so sure of himself, was now a prisoner of the very system he had tried to outsmart. The weight of it all must have been crushing. He had no more options, no more tricks, no more hope. At noon, Bundy's last hope was gone. The Supreme Court had made its decision. There would be no more appeals, no more delays. Bundy would be executed as planned. The man who had been responsible for the deaths of at least 36 women, possibly more, was now facing the end of his own life. When FBI agents proposed a total tally of 36, Bundy responded, "Add one digit to that and you'll have it." Years later, he told Nelson that the common estimate of 35 was accurate, but Keppel wrote that Ted and I both knew the total number was much higher. Robert Keppel was the investigator who got Bundy to come clean. In an interview, Keppel stated his belief that Bundy had killed at least 50 and maybe 75. In the hours that followed, Bundy would have little to do but wait. Wait for the execution. Wait for the moment that would bring an end to his life, to the terror he had caused, and to the fear he had instilled in so many. The wait must have been unbearable as the minutes ticked by and the reality of what was coming loomed larger with every passing second. By 1 p.m., a moment that had been years in the making arrived. Ted Bundy's final visit with his mother, Louise. For years, Louise had believed her son was innocent, despite all the evidence proving otherwise. She had always hoped that Ted would be proven not guilty, but now she had to face the truth. This meeting was their last, and the room was filled with the weight of the moment. There were no big speeches, no dramatic goodbyes. The conversation was brief, with many words left unspoken. Louise still loved her son, but the reality of who he had become was too much to ignore. Ted, perhaps trying to stay calm, didn't show deep emotion. They both knew this was the last time they would see each other. At 3 p.m., Ted Bundy met with Reverend Fred Lawrence, a chaplain who had been with him in his final days. Religion had become a big part of Bundy's life near the end. Some people believed that Ted was trying to find some form of peace, hoping for forgiveness. But others thought this might be just another act to change how people saw him. He had spent years lying and manipulating people, so could his sudden interest in religion be real? Their talks were private, but it's clear that Bundy seemed to be looking for some comfort. Was he trying to feel better about what he did? Was he truly sorry, or just trying to make himself look better before he died? People questioned whether this was a real change or just another trick. After years of hiding the truth about his actions, Bundy might have been trying to escape the guilt he had never faced before. At 5 o'clock in the evening, Bundy sat down for his final interview, this time with James Dobson, a well-known Christian leader. This interview would stir up a lot of controversy. During it, Bundy blamed pornography for his crimes, saying it had fueled his violent urges. He suggested that his addiction to it played a big part in his murders. But many people found this claim hard to believe. Bundy had spent his life trying to manipulate people, so it was hard to know if this was true remorse or just another way to avoid taking full responsibility for his actions. His words about pornography seemed too convenient. It was easier for him to say that something outside himself caused his violence than admit the darker truths about his own character. Some people saw this as Bundy trying to hide behind an excuse, while others believed it was a sign that he had finally realized the depth of his crimes. Dr. Dorothy Ottnow Lewis, a psychiatrist who examined Bundy, initially suspected bipolar disorder, but later considered the possibility of multiple personality disorder. Some who knew Bundy claimed to have witnessed chilling transformations. His great-aunt once described him as turning into an entirely different person, someone unrecognizable, someone terrifying. A prison official in Tallahassee echoed this, recalling a moment when Bundy's demeanor changed so drastically that he emitted a strange aura and suddenly became unrecognizable. Yet most psychiatrists rejected the idea of psychosis. Instead, Bundy fit the profile of a textbook psychopath. He scored 39 out of 40 on the psychopathy checklist, a near-perfect score indicating extreme narcissism, manipulation, and an utter lack of empathy. At 6 p.m., Ted Bundy was given his last meal. Steak cooked medium rare, eggs over easy, toast with butter and jelly, milk and juice. But despite the ample food, Bundy barely touched it. His appetite had vanished, overwhelmed by the fear and anxiety of what was to come. He had the option to eat his final meal, but the psychological turmoil he was facing made it impossible to enjoy it. By 8 p.m., crowds had formed. Some came to protest, while others cheered Bundy's execution. The media chaos was noticeable, with news cameras flashing and crowds chanting. One of the most notorious chants was heard repeatedly in the air. "Burn, Bundy, burn." This reflected the widespread outrage and vengeance that many people felt toward him for his heinous crimes. While the crowd gathered outside, Bundy remained locked away in his death row cell, isolated and alone. By 10 p.m., Bundy had his final meetings with those who had been with him during the last stretch of his life. His attorney, Polly Nelson, and the prison chaplain. His attorney later described Bundy as a broken man, overwhelmed by fear and close to panic. As midnight approached, Bundy's night was filled with silence. By this time, Bundy had been offered medication to help him sleep, but it remains unclear whether he took it. The psychological weight of the situation, coupled with the pressure of knowing that his death was drawing closer, left Bundy in a restless state. The execution. At 6 a.m. on January 4, 1989, Ted Bundy's final moments began with the simple routines of prison life. He was escorted to the shower, his last one before his execution. As he stood under the cold stream of water, it was a quiet reminder that he would never again experience such simple comforts. Afterward, he was dressed in a clean prison uniform, the stark gray fabric marking his transition from life to death. Bundy had been offered a sedative to calm his nerves, but he declined. He chose to face his execution with clarity, unwilling to numb the reality of what was coming. At 6:30 a.m., Bundy was led through the narrow, dimly lit corridors of Florida State Prison. As he made his way toward the execution chamber, the reality of his fear became visible. Those who witnessed the walk described Bundy's palpable anxiety. His body was stiff, his eyes darting nervously as he was escorted to his fate. Witnesses who had previously seen Bundy noticed a distinct change in him now. There was no bravado or faked calmness, only the raw human emotion of fear. As he got closer to the chair, he felt the weight of his past sins, the pain he caused, and the lives he destroyed come down on him. By 7 o'clock, Bundy was strapped into Old Sparky, the electric chair. His wrists, ankles, and chest were tightly restrained, ensuring that he couldn't move as the final moment approached. The electrodes were attached to his body, and a wet sponge was placed on his shaved head to ensure the electrical current would flow smoothly. The room was silent as the witnesses watched, some with faces of anger, others with sorrow. The weight of the moment hung in the air. No one spoke, no one moved. This was the end of a long and bloody journey for Bundy, and all that remained now was the final execution. As the straps tightened and the electrodes were in place, there was no more room for denial, no more chance to escape the consequences of his actions. Just before the switch was pulled, Bundy was given a final opportunity to speak. His words were brief, but they carried a weight that resonated with the witnesses present. He turned to his two friends, Jim and Fred, and said, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." There were no grand confessions, no remorseful pleas. There was only a simple message to those closest to him. Bundy's final words reflected a man who chose to focus on the few people who had stood by him, even after everything he had done. At exactly 7 o'clock and 7 minutes, the switch was pulled. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through Bundy's body. Witnesses reported that his body tensed violently in response to the electrical current. The air filled with the smell of burning flesh, a harsh and unforgettable scent that marked the finality of his execution. The man who had terrorized the nation, who had evaded justice for years, was finally being brought to an end in a brutal, irreversible moment. His body twitched, and for a few moments it seemed as though the electrical surge might have been too much, too intense for him to survive. But Bundy's body was still. The execution had been carried out, and the man who had committed such heinous crimes had finally met his end. The prison doctor declared him dead at 7:16 in the morning on January 24, 1989. The time of death was recorded, marking the end of one of America's most infamous criminal stories. It was over. There would be no more trials, no more appeals. Bundy's life had come to a violent and permanent end. Ted Bundy's death on January 24, 1989, brought a sense of closure to many, but it also left a lasting impact on the people involved and on society. While his life ended in the electric chair, the effects of his crimes would continue to affect the families of his victims, the public, and even the criminal justice system. After Bundy's execution, some people felt relief. For the families of his victims, there was a feeling that justice had finally been done after years of suffering. However, not everyone felt the same way. Some people believed that killing Bundy didn't really bring closure to the families, because the pain of losing a loved one could never be erased. Outside the prison, there were protests. Some people thought Bundy deserved to die for his terrible crimes, while others believed that the death penalty was wrong, no matter what. These mixed opinions showed that people had strong feelings about how Bundy's life should end. Inside the prison, Bundy's execution marked the end of years of legal battles and appeals. He had once tried to use the legal system to avoid his punishment, but in the end, he couldn't escape it. His death was final, but it left a deep mark on the justice system. Ted Bundy's crimes made people think about what drives someone to kill. He was a smart and charming man, which made his actions even more terrifying. He didn't look like a killer, and that made his crimes harder to understand. Experts began to study Bundy's life in detail to try to understand why he killed. Bundy himself tried to explain his actions, blaming things like pornography for his violent behavior. But many experts didn't believe him. They thought he was just trying to make excuses. What was clear, though, was that Bundy was a master manipulator who could charm people, even as he was killing. Despite his attempt to blame others, Bundy's death didn't erase the fact that he had taken the lives of at least 30 women. His crimes left deep scars on the people he hurt, and the effects would last for a long time. Even though Bundy died, his story didn't end. His crimes were so shocking that people continued to talk about him for years. His story has been told in books, documentaries, and movies. Bundy was seen as a person who could trick everyone around him. He seemed like a normal guy, but underneath he was a killer. Bundy was a monster, a man who manipulated, tortured, and killed without mercy. But he was also once an innocent child, someone's son, a person who had choices. Where did it all go wrong? And more importantly, could another Bundy be out there right now, walking among us, waiting to strike? His story is over, but the questions he left behind may never be answered.